By the middle of the 1920s, the United States was producing almost half of everything manufactured on the entire planet. Cars, radios, refrigerators, and stock market fortunes multiplied at a pace nobody in history had ever seen before. Americans called it prosperity. Within a decade, that same country would have a quarter of its workforce unemployed, breadlines stretching for city blocks, and shanty towns named mockingly after its own president. This video covers the whole thematic arc every exam board sets. What actually caused the boom, who was quietly left out of it the entire time, the culture war that boom provoked, and exactly how and why it all came apart so completely, so fast in October 1929. Let's start with the government that let the boom happen in the first place, almost entirely on purpose. Every American president through the entire 1920s, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, was a Republican, and their shared economic philosophy shaped the whole decade that followed. It's called laissez-faire, the belief that government should interfere with business as little as humanly possible and simply let the market run itself. In practice, this meant three specific policies the exam boards expect you to name directly. Taxes were cut sharply, on the theory that people with more money in their pockets would spend it on American goods. Regulation on business was kept deliberately light. And tariffs, taxes on imported foreign goods, were raised significantly, making foreign products more expensive and protecting American companies from outside competition. It was a coherent, genuinely popular strategy at the time. It also left remarkably few breaks in the system for when things eventually, inevitably, started to go wrong. Henry Ford's moving assembly line, refined through the 1910s and dominant by the 1920s, transformed how America actually made things. Instead of skilled workers building one complete car from start to finish, each worker now performed a single, repeated task as the unfinished vehicle moved past them on a conveyor system. The results were staggering. A new Model T rolled off Ford's production line roughly every 10 seconds by the mid-1920s, and the price of a car fell dramatically low enough that Ford's own factory workers could realistically afford to buy the very cars they were building. Other industries copied the technique immediately. Mass production meant genuinely mass consumption for the first time in human history, and it's the single economic engine underlying almost everything else in this video. More goods, produced faster and cheaper than ever before, needed millions of ordinary Americans buying them just as fast to keep the whole system running. Mass production alone doesn't explain the boom. Americans also needed a genuinely new way to actually pay for all of it, and they found one. Buying on credit, known then as installment buying, paying in small regular amounts over time rather than the full price up front. Suddenly, radios, refrigerators, telephones, and vacuum cleaners became affordable for millions of ordinary working households that could never have paid the full price in one go. For every single refrigerator owned by an American family in 1921, there were 167 owned by 1929, an almost unbelievable rate of adoption for a genuinely new consumer technology. A brand new advertising industry exploded specifically to convince people they needed all of this. It felt, to millions of ordinary Americans living through it, like limitless, permanent prosperity. Underneath the surface, though, it was substantially built on debt, and debt has an uncomfortable habit of eventually needing to be repaid. The same optimism and the same appetite for debt swept directly into the stock market. Share prices on the New York Stock Exchange climbed relentlessly through the decade, and buying stock increasingly felt less like careful long-term investment and more like an easy, obvious way to get rich. The real danger was a practice called buying on margin. A buyer paid as little as 10% of a stock's actual price up front and simply borrowed the remaining 90% from a broker, betting entirely that the share price would keep climbing fast enough to comfortably repay that loan. By 1929, brokers had lent small investors well over $8.5 billion this way. It worked beautifully, for as long as prices only ever kept rising. The entire structure assumed, with total confidence, that share prices would never seriously fall. That assumption was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. Here's the crucial exam qualification that separates a genuinely strong answer from a merely descriptive one. The boom was real, but it was never remotely universal, and top answers explicitly say so. American farmers had massively expanded production during the First World War to feed a starving Europe. When European farming recovered afterward, demand collapsed, but American farmers, now deep in debt for land and machinery, kept overproducing anyway just to service that same debt, driving crop prices down even further in a vicious, self-defeating cycle. Older industries, coal mining and traditional textile manufacturing especially, also struggled badly throughout the decade, undercut by newer technology and never sharing properly in the boom at all. Roughly 40% of American families, by some contemporary estimates, lived below a reasonable poverty line throughout this supposedly prosperous decade. The 1920s boom was concentrated heavily in cities, in specific industries, and, as the next several beats make clear, overwhelmingly among white Americans specifically. Rapid economic change reshaped American culture just as dramatically as it reshaped the economy, and the decade earned its popular nickname, the Jazz Age, directly from the music that defined it. Jazz, originating substantially from Black musical traditions in New Orleans, spread nationally through radio broadcasts and an explosion of new nightclubs, crossing racial and social lines in ways that deeply unsettled plenty of more conservative, older Americans. Cinema became genuinely mass entertainment for the first time, with movie palaces opening in every major city. Flappers, young women who cut their hair short, wore noticeably shorter skirts, smoked and drank in public, and openly challenged older, stricter expectations about how women were supposed to behave, became one of the decade's most enduring, most photographed cultural symbols. To many younger, urban Americans, this all represented thrilling, overdue modernity. To many older and more rural Americans, it looked like nothing less than moral collapse, unfolding in real time, right in front of them. In August 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was formally ratified, guaranteeing American women the right to vote nationwide after decades of sustained, often bitterly opposed campaigning. Women's lives changed in other genuinely significant ways across the decade, too. More women worked in offices and in growing retail and clerical jobs than ever before, more attended college and changing fashions. That same shorter hair and shorter hemline reflected real, tangible new freedoms in how women could move through and present themselves in public life. But the exam-relevant limits matter just as much as the genuine gains here. Most working women remained concentrated in low-paid, low-status jobs. Married women faced continued, powerful social pressure to leave paid work entirely once they had children, and formal political power, elected office specifically, remained overwhelmingly, almost completely male throughout the entire decade. Real, significant change, running directly alongside real, stubbornly persistent limits. The Great Migration, thousands upon thousands of Black Americans moving from the rural, segregated South to northern cities in search of factory jobs and some genuine measure of relative safety, fed directly into one of the decade's single greatest cultural achievements, the Harlem Renaissance. Centered in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, this was a genuine explosion of Black literary, musical, and artistic talent. Writers including Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, and musicians including Duke Ellington, all producing work of real, lasting, undeniable significance to American culture as a whole. And yet, this remarkable cultural flourishing happened alongside continued, entrenched segregation, alongside the Ku Klux Klan's violent nationwide resurgence, which you're about to see in real detail, and alongside deep, structural, everyday economic inequality that the boom, whatever it delivered elsewhere, did essentially nothing whatsoever to fix for Black Americans specifically. Cultural triumph and continued oppression, running in direct, uncomfortable parallel, throughout the very same decade. The 1917 Russian Revolution, followed immediately by a wave of anarchist bombings across several American cities in 1919, triggered what became widely known as the Red Scare, a period of intense, often wildly exaggerated public fear specifically of communism and of foreign radical political ideas generally. The federal government responded with the Palmer raids, mass arrests targeting thousands of suspected radicals and immigrants, frequently with strikingly little regard for genuine due process or actual, concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrant anarchists controversially convicted and ultimately executed in 1927 on evidence historians still consider genuinely questionable to this day, became an internationally notorious symbol of this exact same anti-radical hysteria in action. The Red Scare mattered for far more than just its own moment. It fed directly and substantially into the immigration restrictions and the resurgent, nativist prejudice you're about to see across the very next few beats of this video. Fear of communism, combined with sustained, broader nativist prejudice against recent immigrants, produced two major, deliberately restrictive pieces of federal legislation. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 introduced numerical limits on immigration for the first time in American history, based directly on each nationality's existing share of the American population. The National Origins Act of 1924 tightened these specific restrictions dramatically further, explicitly favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, Britain and Germany especially, while sharply, deliberately restricting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and virtually eliminating immigration from Asia entirely. The stated justification was maintaining a specific, existing national character. The practical effect was to codify a clear racial and ethnic hierarchy directly, formally into United States federal law. This is a genuinely crucial exam point worth holding in view. The same booming, modernizing decade celebrated for its cars and its radios was simultaneously closing its own front door, quite deliberately, to millions of people it now considered simply undesirable. The Ku Klux Klan, largely dormant since the 19th century, experienced an enormous, genuinely startling nationwide resurgence throughout the 1920s, reaching an estimated 3 to 6 million members at its mid-decade peak, a scale far beyond its original, narrower Reconstruction-era incarnation. This new Klan explicitly targeted Catholics, Jews, and recent immigrants generally, alongside its continued, foundational violent racism against Black Americans, and it operated openly and with real, substantial political influence across the Midwest and parts of the West, not merely, as many people still assume today, in the American South specifically. Klan members won real elected office in several states, and the organization actively, successfully lobbied for exactly the restrictive immigration laws you just saw in the previous beat. Its later 1920s decline stemmed mainly from internal corruption scandals and damaging leadership infighting, not from any genuine, sustained loss of underlying public support for what it actually stood for. A sobering, necessary counterweight to any purely celebratory account of this decade. In 1925, Tennessee teacher John Scopes was deliberately, openly prosecuted for teaching human evolution in a public school classroom, directly violating a brand new state law called the Butler Act. The resulting trial became a genuine national spectacle, broadcast live on radio to a huge audience, pitting the country's most famous defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, against three-time presidential candidate and committed Christian fundamentalist William Jennings Bryan. Scopes was, in the end, formally convicted and fined a modest $100. But the trial's real, lasting significance runs far deeper than that narrow legal verdict. It exposed a genuine, deep, unresolved cultural fault line running right through 1920s America, urban versus rural, scientific modernism versus religious traditionalism, that the simple, celebratory Roaring Twenties story routinely leaves out entirely. The same decade that built the assembly line and broadcast jazz nationwide on the radio was also fighting, openly and passionately, over whether evolution itself could even legally be taught in an American public school classroom. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, and the Federal Volstead Act that formally enforced it, banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages across the entire United States starting in January 1920. The movement behind Prohibition had deep, genuine roots. Religious temperance campaigners and women's groups specifically had long, sincerely argued that alcohol drove domestic violence, entrenched poverty, and serious, widespread workplace accidents. For a brief period immediately afterward, alcohol consumption genuinely did fall measurably. But banning something tens of millions of ordinary Americans still actively wanted to drink created an enormous, immediate demand for an illegal alternative supply, and where there's that kind of demand, criminal supply reliably, predictably follows close behind. Prohibition is a textbook exam case study in the frequently enormous gap between passing a law with entirely good intentions and that same law actually, successfully working as its designers originally, sincerely intended it to. Illegal drinking establishments, known as speakeasies because patrons needed to speak quietly, discreetly through a barely cracked door, or use a specific coded password to gain entry, sprang up by the thousands in every major American city. New York City alone is estimated to have had around 100,000 of them operating at once, roughly double the number of legal bars that had existed there before Prohibition began. Bootleggers, people who illegally manufactured, smuggled, or simply sold alcohol, supplied this enormous, thriving underground market, ranging from small home distillers running modest, improvised backyard stills all the way up to genuinely massive, highly organized international smuggling operations. Corrupt police officers and local politicians were frequently paid off to simply look the other way. Prohibition, intended to make America a cleaner, safer, more orderly, more sober place, had, within just a very few years, instead created a colossal, thoroughly organized black market economy, worth many hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and it needed genuinely serious criminal organization to actually run it. Organized crime figures grew extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily powerful directly by supplying illegal alcohol at scale, and none more famously, more visibly, than Chicago's Al Capone. Capone controlled a sprawling bootlegging empire estimated at its peak to be earning well over $60 million a year, and he maintained that lucrative operation through sustained, often shockingly public violence, including the notorious St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, in which 7 rival gang members were gunned down in cold blood inside a Chicago garage. Local police forces and city governments were frequently and deeply corrupted by gangster money right alongside him, undermining law enforcement's basic ability, or in some documented cases its genuine willingness, to meaningfully act at all. Capone was, in the end, convicted in 1931, but notably not for any of his extensive, well-documented bootlegging or violence. Prosecutors could only make federal tax evasion charges genuinely stick. Prohibition had created a criminal economy so vast, so lucrative, and so thoroughly entrenched that even its single most notorious, most visible beneficiary proved remarkably hard to actually convict for the underlying crime itself. By 1929, serious economic warning signs were already accumulating, largely unheeded, well before any actual crash arrived. Industrial production had quietly begun to slow. Consumer spending, the very engine that had driven the entire boom from the beginning, was gradually softening as more and more households reached the genuine practical limits of how much additional debt they could realistically keep taking on. Yet stock prices kept climbing anyway, increasingly disconnected from the underlying, actual profitability of the real companies those very same shares supposedly represented. Investors were now buying stock, in large part, simply because prices had reliably risen the week before, a self-reinforcing, self-fueling cycle with essentially no genuine floor holding it up if that basic underlying confidence ever seriously wavered. A small number of more cautious economists did warn, publicly and directly, that the market was dangerously overvalued at this exact point. They were, for the most part at the time, simply ignored. On the 24th of October 1929, a day that quickly became known as Black Thursday, panicked investors began selling their shares in genuinely enormous, unprecedented volume. Roughly 12.9 million shares changed hands that single day alone, a new record by a very wide margin. A consortium of major Wall Street bankers pooled their own private money in a coordinated, deliberate attempt to prop up falling prices and restore basic market confidence, and it worked, but only briefly, buying the market perhaps a few days of relative, superficial calm. Confidence, once genuinely shaken at this kind of underlying scale, proved extremely difficult to fully, durably restore. Ordinary ripple effects from that single day's dramatic volume were already spreading rapidly beyond Wall Street itself, into newspaper headlines nationwide, and into increasingly anxious private conversations in banks, businesses, and households right across the entire country. The worst, though everyone still hoped otherwise at the time, had not yet actually arrived. 5 days later, on the 29th of October 1929, now remembered as Black Tuesday, the market collapsed completely and decisively. Roughly 16.4 million shares were sold in a single day, obliterating the previous week's already record-breaking volume, and share prices simply cratered across the board, essentially without any meaningful exception. Investors who had bought heavily on margin, borrowing the bulk of the purchase price against the assumption of endlessly rising prices, were now left owing genuinely large sums of real money on stock that had, in some documented cases, become worth barely a fraction of what they had originally, confidently paid for it. Fortunes built up carefully across the entire preceding decade were wiped out within literally a matter of hours. The New York Stock Exchange itself did not physically close, contrary to a persistent popular myth many people still believe today, but the American financial system had, in every meaningful practical sense that actually mattered, just suffered a catastrophic, structural, era-defining shock. The exam boards expect you to explain several genuinely interlocking causes here, not just point to one single dramatic moment on the trading floor. Overproduction meant factories had already been quietly making considerably more goods than consumers could actually afford to keep buying for a while before the crash itself even happened. Uneven distribution of the boom's substantial wealth meant the great majority of ordinary Americans simply never had enough real spending power to sustain genuinely long-term demand at the pace industry needed. Margin buying meant that a comparatively small initial price fall could trigger a rapid, self-reinforcing cascade of forced, desperate selling. And thousands of smaller regional banks, which had themselves recklessly invested heavily in the same overheated stock market, began failing in genuinely large numbers almost immediately afterward, wiping out ordinary Americans' savings alongside their stock holdings in the very same collapse. The crash didn't simply cause the depression on its own. It violently, suddenly exposed structural weaknesses in the underlying economy that had, in truth, been quietly building for a good few years already. The crash rapidly, relentlessly cascaded into the wider real economy across the following 3 years. Banks failed by the thousands nationwide, wiping out ordinary depositors' life savings, since deposit insurance simply did not exist yet at this point in American history. Businesses, unable to secure the credit or genuine consumer demand they urgently needed to keep operating, closed down or cut their workforce sharply. Unemployment climbed steadily and relentlessly, reaching roughly 25% of the entire American workforce by 1932, the worst sustained level in the whole of United States history to that point. Industrial production overall roughly halved across the same brutal 3-year period. Families who had confidently bought their first car, their first radio, their first refrigerator on credit just a few short years earlier now frequently lost their homes entirely when they simply couldn't keep up the payments. The Great Depression had arrived in full, and it would grip the entire country and much of the wider industrialist world for the whole of the following decade. President Herbert Hoover, elected in 1928 on a genuinely confident, sincere promise of continued national prosperity, responded to the unfolding crisis largely within his own core laissez-faire beliefs: modest, limited government loans to failing businesses and banks, but a firm, principal refusal to provide direct federal financial relief straight to unemployed individuals and families themselves. As homelessness spread rapidly nationwide, desperate people built makeshift shanty towns out of scrap wood, corrugated metal, and packing crates on the edges of cities right across the entire country. Bitterly, pointedly, these settlements became widely known as Hoovervilles, a direct, sustained popular rebuke of the president many ordinary Americans now squarely, personally blamed for their own worsening suffering. Newspapers homeless people used as makeshift blankets were mockingly nicknamed Hoover blankets. It's a vivid, memorable, and genuinely exam-useful illustration of just how completely, how personally, public opinion had turned against the government's continued, largely unchanged hands-off economic approach by this specific point. In the summer of 1932, more than 15,000 unemployed First World War veterans, along with many of their own families, marched on Washington, D.C., camping out in a makeshift settlement to demand the early payment of a service bonus that had originally been promised to them, but was not actually due to be paid out until 1945. Congress ultimately refused their specific request. When a substantial number of veterans then refused to simply leave their makeshift Anacostia Flats camp voluntarily, Hoover ordered the United States Army itself, commanded personally by General Douglas MacArthur, to physically clear it by force. Troops used tear gas and bayonets against unarmed American war veterans and their own families, and set fire to the camp's tents and makeshift shelters in the process. Images and newspaper reports of the American military violently attacking its own former soldiers shocked the entire country, and it further, decisively cemented Hoover's image as a president who was fundamentally out of touch with, and actively hostile toward, ordinary Americans' genuine, desperate suffering. It's a genuine exam misconception worth directly correcting here. Hoover did not simply do nothing at all in response to the unfolding crisis. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932, which extended emergency loans specifically to struggling banks, railroads, and other large businesses, and he pushed for modestly increased public works spending intended to help create at least some new jobs. But his consistent, deeply held belief in limited government, individual self-reliance, and voluntary private charity meant he resisted, right up to the very end of his term, providing direct federal financial relief straight to unemployed individuals and their families, which is precisely the specific kind of help millions of genuinely desperate Americans needed most urgently by this point. His actual policies were measured, and by the standards of any previous American president, notably active. They were also judged plainly and honestly against the sheer, overwhelming scale of the crisis actually unfolding around him, nowhere close to sufficient. By the presidential election of November 1932, Herbert Hoover's political position had become essentially untenable. His Democratic opponent, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, promised American voters a fundamentally different, far more active approach: direct, large-scale government intervention specifically to fight unemployment and to genuinely stabilize the shattered banking system, a broad package that would soon become widely known as the New Deal. Roosevelt won in an overwhelming landslide, carrying 42 of the then 48 American states outright. The scale of that victory reflects just how thoroughly, how completely, public confidence in Hoover's laissez-faire approach had collapsed by this specific point in the unfolding crisis. Roosevelt's actual New Deal policies technically sit beyond this particular topic's own strict specification, but his decisive 1932 election victory marks the clear, unmistakable, and genuinely exam-relevant endpoint of the story this video has been building toward the entire time. The old, hands-off economic consensus of the 1920s was now thoroughly, comprehensively finished. So, pulling this whole arc together for the exam hall, what genuinely explains both the 1920s boom and its subsequent, catastrophic collapse? The boom rested on mass production, easy consumer and investor credit, and a deliberately hands-off, laissez-faire government that actively let it all run essentially unchecked. The bust arrived because that exact same boom was substantially built on debt, was never remotely evenly distributed across American society to begin with, and had no genuine safety net whatsoever built in underneath it once confidence, inevitably eventually cracked. And running underneath both halves of the story, boom and bust alike, sits the same recurring pattern this whole video keeps returning to: prosperity and its later, catastrophic absence were never distributed evenly across American society at any single point. Farmers, Black Americans, and recent immigrants had already been substantially left out of the boom itself, well before the Depression then made every single one of their existing situations dramatically, measurably worse. That is the USA, boom, bust, and society, the whole arc every exam board expects you to know. Mass production and easy credit building a genuine, real economic boom, a decade-long culture war over jazz, over prohibition, over evolution in the classroom, running directly alongside that same boom the entire time. Entire groups of Americans, farmers, Black Americans, recent immigrants, substantially left out of the prosperity even at its very peak, and a stock market crash that exposed every single one of those underlying weaknesses all at once, plunging the whole country into the worst economic collapse in its entire history. If you remember one single framework walking into that exam hall, remember this: never describe the 1920s as simply, uniformly roaring for absolutely everyone, and never describe the Depression as simply, purely a Wall Street story with no deeper roots. Both halves of this decade ran unevenly, and explaining exactly who is included and who is left out at each specific stage is precisely what separates a genuinely top-band answer from an average one. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist. Subscribe and good luck in that exam hall.